At the end of last week's video, I used a tricky technique and I made a background panel that I absolutely loved. And a lot of you said you loved it too. Wait till you see what I've done with it. Here's a quick review. I used watercolor cardstock, a large stencil from AALL Create, and some pixie spray on the back, and a clean brayer to really adhere well to the cardstock and prevent water from seeping underneath the stencil edges. Then I sprinkled some Nouveau shimmer powders over top and I added some water. And this is important. Less water than you think. At least less water than I ever think. I wasn't sure there'd be enough spread of the color, especially into those tiny dots around the edges, but trust me, it gets everywhere. These beautiful blends make those big circles look like planets, and it just so happens that I need planets for this week's challenge, which is a limes challenge. But just before we get to that, the one thing that makes this not look like planets is the white background. I wondered if I could just paint over with a wash of dark navy, which I created with the same blue powder plus another one called Storm Cloud, as well as lots of water. Talk about boldly going, right? I wanted it watery so that I wouldn't end up covering the details of the planets, so I needed a lot of water for that. But I wasn't sure if what was on the page already would just blend into the wash, and I certainly didn't want to ruin that panel, so I decided to test my overwatered panel from last week. My strategy was to get in quick, lay down the wash, and then back away and not try to fuss too much. And it worked pretty well here. There's a little movement on some of the dots, but not too bad. So now it's time to try for real. I was really nervous, but I figured out which area I wanted to darken and then I just dove in. At the top, I went back and forth and those dots started really moving. So after that, I tried just going right to left once and then moved further down the panel. I definitely got some horizontal streaks from the colors moving a little bit, but overall I think it went pretty well. I got out my heat tool to try and stop any further movement, and then I added some splattered with the kind of silvery metallic watercolor that I have. They kind of just soaked in at this point, so once it was fully dry later on, I did that step again. Now let's get back to lines, and a quick reminder that lines equals list, include, modify, exclude, and spin. It's my little checklist to help you create your own inspired card without directly copying. It's perfect when you don't have the exact supplies used in the inspiration, or you just want to use an inspiration as a jumping off point. Recently, we talked about whether there are cards that are unlimesable or very difficult to create your own. Amy from the Creativity Playground sent me this photo and challenged me to make my own version. And when I say challenge, that's no joke. I can see right away that this card has 3 elements that are hard to get the look of when you don't have the right stuff. But let's start with the checklist and list. The colors. I see purple, red, blue, yellow, brown, and gray. The techniques. Amy's made a fun fold with a fun wiper pop-up element. She's done some stamping and some coloring and some die cutting. The elements. Well, we've got Star Trek characters on a space background with a big yellow planet. There's that pop-up or wiper with the USS Enterprise and an interesting kind of box fun fold. The 3 things that are going to make this difficult are the specific characters. The only person I have in my supplies is Santa, and he's not going to cut it here, I don't think. That fun fold is just now starting to make sense to me. I mean, I could have sat down and figured out how it worked in exact measurements earlier, but I didn't. And finally, that spaceship. I'm assuming it somehow folds in between the layers and then pops out when the card is opened, but I haven't figured that one out. I'm going to assume for this challenge that I need to make a Star Trek themed card. Let's say I have to make a graduation card for a Trekkie. Although honestly, if I had a Trekkie in my life that I was making cards for on a regular basis, I would just buy this stamp set. It's super cute and perfect for themed cards like this. I started preparing all my elements. I don't have characters, but I do have these 2 shape dies from Tim Holtz that I think will kind of evoke Star Trek. And I'm going to make 1 red and 1 blue, like the uniforms on Amy's card. I grabbed a couple of scraps of watercolor cardstock, and rather than just paint with the powders, I decided to put the powders directly on the cardstock. I think you get more saturated color that way. I'm using the same red and blue that I used in the planet panel, and that will give me some design unity. Check out how this blue is blooming in the water. Isn't that cool? Here's a close-up. These powders are so fun. I've got 1 more scrap of cardstock, and I want some gold. So I grabbed my gold watercolors and I started painting. Oh boy, it looks like I still had blue paint in my brush from a previous session. Okay, I'll just keep going and layer it up. And once it's dry, if I need to, I'll add more layers. Next, I want to make some navy blue cardstock for mats and backgrounds. I'm using some thinner Nina Index cardstock here, since my card base is 110 pounds and the planet panels are 140-pound watercolor cardstock, and I don't want to add a lot more weight. Of course, my ink pad got dry in the middle of all of this, so I grabbed my ink refill and I added some drops of ink all over the foam pad before kind of smooshing them in with the tip of the bottle. Now this bottle's getting empty, so I've added it to my wish list. Juniper Mist is one of my main go-to colors, and when you use your inks for direct-to-paper techniques like this, or gel plate, or ink blending, it's important to have a refill on hand. Once the navy was dry, I deepened it up a bit with my blackjack, which is a very deep gray. This pad is also dry, but I won't make you sit through the refill process again. I don't really care if the color is smooth. In fact, a bit of texture will be more sky-like, won't it? And while it was still damp, I sprayed some Golden Hour Solar Spray over top. This will give me some shimmer as well as something that looks a bit like stars in the sky. My final bit of prep is to make my card base. As I said, I hadn't figured out Amy's fun fold at the time, so I decided to go with my favorite fun fold, which is a Z fold. For my 4 1/4 inch square format, I trimmed a piece of cardstock to 4 1/4 by 11 inches, and I scored it 4 1/4 to create the back panel. Then I scored it 3 3/8 inches from the other end. This will fold the rest of that cardstock in half. But my score buddy doesn't have a groove at 3 3/8, so I have to move the cardstock along by 1/8 of an inch, and then score it 3 1/2. So then my score line is 3 1/2 inches away from the edge of the tool, but it's only 3 3/8 inches from the edge of the cardstock, right? Then I burnished all the folds so that my card base formed kind of a backward Z. I trimmed down my planet panel to create 2 panels that will fit in the card. I blended some Juniper Mist ink around the edges to help give even more of a night sky look, and some of that blackjack ink to really deepen just the very edges as well. I decided to go with the spaced out sentiment, "You're a star." I have this little die from Concord and 9th that kites 5 little stars at once, and then I looked at all my alphabet dies, and I have a lot. I chose this one, which is from Ellen Hudson, and I'm pretty sure it's retired. But I like the all-caps solid font. I feel like it gives a feeling of, well, maybe it's more like Star Wars than Star Trek, but it was the best I had. I cut it from my little gold watercolor cardstock, as well as 2 times from white cardstock, and I used liquid glue to layer them all up. And just to let you know, while I was planning this card, I did spend quite a bit of time on Google looking at Star Trek things like that badge shape, the font of the logo, as well as the characters and famous quotes, to see if I could use any of them as a sentiment. And that's exactly what I would do if this was a real situation where I was trying to make a themed card when I didn't have any theme-specific supplies. I've kind of included the characters with that little uniform shape. The fun fold is my Z fold, and now what about the pop-up? Again, I'm going to go a little more basic, but still I want something that extends beyond my card. I'm thinking some stars, and I have this die that cuts a whole bunch of shapes at once, but I need to figure out how big I want my stars to be. I used my grid on my desk to measure how far out something can go before I need a bigger envelope, and I ended up cutting 2 of each of the smallest 2 stars by trimming cardstock to just cover that area of the die. Finally, it's time to start assembling. I put a square panel of that navy blue to fully cover the inside of the back of the card, and then the smaller navy panel to fully cover the front panel. This part of the planet panel was trimmed to a 3 3/4 inch square, and it'll overhang the front just a little bit. To strengthen the panel and to cover any paint that may be on the back, I trimmed a strip to 5/8 of an inch and I glued it on the very edge of the overhang. Next, I had to stamp the "You're a" part of my star sentiment. But do you think I have that anywhere? I do not. I took a look at one of my favorite sentiment sets from Inkblot Shop, and I have "You're amazing" and "You're the best." And if you don't love stamp surgery, now's the time to look away. I cut the "You're" away from the rest of the stamp by stretching the stamp as much as I could and snipping between the words with small, sharp scissors. I cut on an angle so I can easily put the 2 pieces back together again. And I did the same, and I cut the "A" out of just a note. We could have a big discussion about why, but I know this is a sentiment that I will never use, unless it's a music-themed card. I took a minute to line up the words on my mini Misty, and I stamped them down. As I opened the door, the red shape lifted, and then I wasn't sure if it was lined up properly. Honestly, at this point of the card, I was ready to assemble and be done, so I risked it all and stamped again. It was slightly off, but in some ways it just made it darker and more legible. Have I mentioned that I'm pretty impatient sometimes? I glued the gold star letters directly to the front planet panel, and I popped up the red shape. I added the blue shape, stamped with congratulations from that same sentiment set on the inside, and then I went to work on my pop-up stars. I kept it simple and trimmed a very narrow strip of acetate. I cut it in half, then added glue to the back of a star. I laid the acetate strip in, and then I added glue to the matching star, and then kind of just sandwiched that acetate in between. I did that for both of my stars, and then I played around with them to figure out where I wanted to have them. Remember, I want the card to fit into an A2 size envelope. Because the acetate is quite thin, the longer it is, the floppier it's going to be, and I don't want that either. I positioned them to the right side of the panel to kind of balance the red uniform shape on the left when you're looking at the front. And I glued the acetate strips down. I was able to play around a little while the glue was wet to be sure I was happy with the positioning, and then I used that other piece of the planet panel to cover off the strips. The panel gives a bit of interest to the inside of the card as well, so that's a win-win. I finished by adding some of those little stars to the front of the card and also on the inside back panel. Okay, let's see it in action. It fits in my A2 envelope, and it even looks like I had a bit more space I could have used to extend the stars, but that's okay. The 3 panels are definitely space-themed, and my daughter said she knew it was Star Trek right away, so now let's quickly compare the 2 cards. As I looked at all the items we listed about Amy's card, I'm not sure I actually included any of them without modification, except maybe a space theme with a planet. So let's jump ahead. I modified the fun fold, the pop-up, and even the colors. I used a specific technique to create my planet background. I excluded the characters and the coloring. And for my spin or my signature finishing touch, I created my card around my usual 4¼ inch square size. So while my card is quite different in details from Amy's, I think I met the challenge pretty well by generalizing the theme from Star Trek to space and including key elements like that big planet, a fun fold, and a pop-up. Well, I guess it's not really a pop-up, but an extending element, and using shapes and colors that are consistent with Star Trek. As I said, if I knew I needed to make a lot of Star Trek cards, I would look around for more specific stamps and dies and buy them. But for a one-off, I think this approach gives great results. What do you think? How would you approach making a card with a specific theme when you don't have the themed supplies? I'd love to hear, so let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.